Welcome to the Athletic Edge podcast. I'm your host, Liam Evans, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Evans Performance. This is a podcast tailored for athletes, coaches, and parents interested in every facet of athletic development. Join me and guests from around the world as we dive into game-changing tools and expert insights covering strength training, performance enhancement, and long-term athletic development strategies. Uncover the keys to elevate your athletic potential, drawing from trusted resources to safely and effectively navigate your training and build your athletic edge. All right, welcome back to the podcast. Today we have on Joe Pedulla, who is a strength coach over at the University of Oklahoma. Joe, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite. I'm excited to talk to you.
And I do want to apologize for anybody listening. I have a little bit of a cold right now, so if there's any raspy voice or anything like that, that is on me. But hopefully Joe will do most of the talking. But
it's that time of year for the sickness.
Yeah, no, man. Especially with my population, the kids and everything, man. I swear everybody's getting sick. But it is what it is. Getting over it now. But definitely didn't want to cancel this. Didn't want to reschedule. So I'm glad we're here. Before we get into anything, do you want to just give a quick background on yourself and kind of how you got to where you are?
Of course. So I'm 25 years old. This is my second year at the University of Oklahoma. I work with softball and women's golf. Prior to that, I'll just start from the beginning. In 2019, I was a physical therapy aide in my hometown in New Jersey. And that's the time period where I learned I wanted to go into strength and conditioning. I wanted to be on the front end of athletes' development. I really do enjoy working with athletes that are rehabbing, but it wasn't my forte. I'm a planner. I like to think in advance. I like development. So I fell into strength and conditioning. In 2020, I got my first strength and conditioning internship under Zach Dakin at TCU. And following that, I did an internship and also started working full-time for a private facility in New Jersey in my hometown as well, called NJ Fast, which is no longer operating. But I had another internship there, and then they hired me full-time, started working there after I graduated college. A funny story, you probably know this, you've listened to the Strength Coach Network podcast, but my first week on that job, the guy that hired me quit. So I'm 21 years old, just getting my feet wet, working full time, and I ended up running this private facility on my own until Christmas Eve of 2021. So that was a big challenge. And from there, I did 2 years with the Kansas City Royals in the minor leagues. And now I find myself here in Norman, so hoping to stay here for a while. Amidst all that, in 2022, I opened my LLC, Pedulla Performance, and that's been a big focus of mine, especially this past year with the people that I've attracted. It's been a lot more of a time commitment, and I've enjoyed building that. So pretty much my background.
Yeah, so I do remember hearing on the other podcast you saying that you kind of got thrust into that role at 21. So just for context, what was the size of that gym? What populations kind of were you dealing with? So how did that go?
It was a pretty small facility. So it was owned by the same doctor that owned a physical therapy practice that was downstairs. So 2 levels to this building, PT clinic / orthopedics downstairs, and then upstairs you had the strength and conditioning facility. So 2 different businesses, same owner. So the clientele ranged from kids as young as 6 or 7 years old, like really early youth athletic development, to college athletes that were 21, 22 years old. So I remember in the summertime, I had a lot more college athletes. And during the academic semesters, they'd go back to their universities, and I did a lot of group training with youth athletes. So very diverse clientele, a great challenge because of that. And obviously a challenge just being alone in that and having to market and advertise and go meet people and upkeep the facility and all those things. I did a lot of group training in that job, very tight space. So as you know, as a strength coach, making good use of your space and programming around the equipment that you have. I learned a lot of valuable skills with those particular things and challenges in that job. So yeah, that was a very interesting dynamic.
Was there anything that you kind of took from there when you then went on to the Royals, or was it just 2 different ends of the spectrum?
It's so different. It's so different. I mean, I definitely took a lot of things. Well, here's actually a very insightful thing. I think that people think that just because athletes are at the professional level, their training age is advanced,
Mhm.
and it's actually not true at all. It's actually quite opposite. And now, as you know, with early specialization, most of these athletes are not experiencing general movement skills. So I saw a lot of kids when I was at NJ Fast that were 14, 15 that were light years ahead of some kids that I had in Kansas City that were 20, 21 years old as far as technical competency goes and understanding how to move and understanding how to execute basics of a programs. Just not being blinded by the fact that they're pros and assessing them for their training age was a skill that I was able to bring to Kansas City, I think, and not do more complicated things than I really had to do to prepare these
Mhm.
athletes. So I think a lot of the guys that came through the NCAA and were drafted in the Major League Draft are obviously well better off than some of the kids you get straight out of high school or from Cuba or Venezuela or the Dominican Republic or Mexico. The background and how they're prepared for the next level is very, very different. So that was a valuable thing that I took from NJ Fast for sure.
When you were with the Royals, where were you actually based? Where was that team?
I started in Arizona for spring training, of
Mhm.
course, and I actually started as a part-time employee. They took me on and they said, "You're not experienced enough. You're going to work in the AZL, the Arizona Complex League, for
Mhm.
the first year." And 3 weeks in, they took me into the office. They said, "Look, you made a decent impression. We're going to give you the full-time role that you originally applied for." So that was huge. So year one was in Columbia, South Carolina, same town where the University of South Carolina is in, if you're familiar. So that was year one. That was low A. Year two was high A in Davenport, Iowa, or Quad Cities, Iowa, right on the Mississippi. I actually lived in Illinois, across the bridge to get to work, and then
Yeah.
you're in Iowa. So, um, yeah, and then from there, I drove straight from Iowa to Norman, Oklahoma for the OU job. So that was in August.
So you had a busy few years then, traveling
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. So I was in Arizona for spring training, and then you have instructional league after the regular season where you have athletes that need more development or athletes where the front office felt as though they could maximize their
Mhm.
time developing a little more because they maybe underperformed a little bit. Or, we had a strength camp, we called it, where you had mostly kids from the Dominican Republic who are being introduced to how things are done in the United States. So that's that time period where it's a lot more development. It's like a spring training round two. Then you go home for 3 months and then you're back in January.
Yeah. So is baseball, from what I gather, it's not huge here, but there's a little bit of baseball here. But is it one of those sports where early specialization is huge, or is it one where kids have a little more freedom with schedules to play other sports until they're like 15, 16?
I'm actually going to say this based off like geography. So like
Okay.
on the East Coast, yeah, I grew up in New Jersey. You can't play ball year round. You can
True.
play ball year round in California. You can play ball year round in Florida, in Georgia. So like, we used to go to tournaments in Georgia. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Perfect Game, but the Perfect Game tournaments in Georgia,
Okay. Yeah.
and like we would get waxed by some of these dudes. And I think it's just because like, well, they're more skilled. They just have more time playing the game, and there's positives and negatives to that. Like I said, just the physical competencies and the what we call like physical literacy or just general human movement might be lacking in that population. But yeah, nowadays early specialization is the thing. And I think that's just the model now. It's just lessons and practice and skill practice, and not much time for the physical development. And we have, I think, a lot less late bloomers now because of that. I think I'm a late bloomer. I didn't play ball year round. I wasn't the best baseball player until I started developing as a pitcher in college. I peaked when I was 20 years old, but some of these kids are peaking when they're 17, 18, and I think that's a problem. And I attribute that to my focus on off seasons, true off seasons,
Hmm.
and a lot of athletes across the United States don't have a true off season. So that's especially true in softball. Especially true in softball. The workloads in the summertime are out of control. But
I was
yeah,
I was going to say, because a lot of, whether it's softball or college baseball, a lot of the players say they even do play on the East Coast or Northeast or something for college. Will they go and play somewhere or winter ball somewhere else? Or how does that work?
Yeah, some athletes, well, in pro ball, some athletes might go play winter. Let's say they're injured, they miss a lot of time, they're going to play winter ball. A lot of
Okay.
guys go to a different country to play winter ball. A lot of my athletes now at the college level, not many are going to play summer ball. Some represent some national teams. It
Hmm.
really depends on again, like if you missed a big chunk of the season or if you need more development, that might be a conversation that's had amongst the sports staff and the athlete. But I definitely feel like playing in the off season is pretty common in professional baseball. Um, so yeah, that's what I'd say about that.
Do you have any kind of criteria that you're looking for as far as when you're getting new athletes in to see, what type of training age they have, what type of physical literacy, physical competencies they have?
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody the other day about this, and I think the conversation came up. They asked me about what I think about movement screens. And
That's a
my
good one.
answer was, I don't really like them. And the reason why is you're missing out on training time, and you're gonna learn what their movement issues are by just watching them train. And people think that that's lazy or that's like flawed programming or coaching. But I think one of my biggest problems is the athletes get to campus, and I've got a very short time window to get them ready. So that kind of produces a little bit of the need for urgency to get them ready. So I really just watch them train, and it's a slow cooking process, and just learning what they do well and what they don't do well, and trying to tailor the training to what their body prefers from an anthropometric and motor control standpoint over time. My assessments, I don't have testing battery days. We do force plate testing twice a week. I do Nordboard testing. I have conversations with the athletes like, hey, where are some areas that you feel are really beat up? Where do you feel beat up after training, after a game? Where do you feel like you're weak? Questions like that allow the athlete, one, to have a little bit of autonomy about the direction of the program, and then they have a little bit more of this psychological buy-in and trust with you. I think we as coaches kind of short sell the athlete's ability to know their own body, and we like to act like we know their bodies better than they do. But I actually think athletes are a lot more intelligent than we think they are. So I ask a lot of questions about what their subjective experience is with their training process, what they've done in the past. I do a lot of work to understand where they've come from with our transfers, and also with our high school then come into our program, is just talking to their strength coaches over the summertime, getting those phone numbers, having conversations like, hey, what was so-and-so's commitment like this summertime? What was their training frequency? How often did you see them? What were your programming habits? And just trying to ascertain some fundamental understanding of what their experience is. And that's gone a long, long way with how I target certain things in their program. So I do a lot of work in that regard. We also use motor preferences here at OU. There's a lot of caveats to the system. I know there's some things that people don't agree with, but using some of the screening tools that they've done with our athletes has helped me do some of the things that I do. But I wouldn't say that motor preferences is something that dictates everything that I'm doing with them. I would say that it impacts a very small fraction of what I'm doing. If anything, it's impacting how I'm cueing certain things, and it's validating some assumptions that I make based off the testing information that I'm already gathering, and the
Mhm.
conversations I'm having and what I'm seeing.
Do you want to give, for people that might not know, do you want to just give a quick background on what motor preferences is?
Motor preferences is it's a screening system and kind of a diagnostic system to basically determine it's what it sounds like. It's the motor patterns that the athlete performs to best execute their sporting task given their neurological and genetic makeup. I think that's the best way to summarize it. They kind of have two buckets on polar ends of a spectrum. They have aerials and terrestrials, and there are some anthropometric and force and time differences between either athlete. Typically, your aerials are your elastic, fascial. I say fascial because there's a lot of different terms people use for these athletes, tendon driven, elastic driven.
Yeah.
Hunter mentioned this on your
Yeah.
podcast the other day. So that's usually that bucket. The aerials, usually they're really good at max velocity. They're very springy. They handle sprint volume pretty well. Compression, long time frames where you're compressing them with heavy strength training is not always the most effective thing for them. They respond really well to low doses. Then you have your terrestrials who are really good in flexion. They squat really well. They're more force dominant. Maybe they have wider ISA. So they were a lot more nuanced this year when they came and talked to us. And I think last year when they were getting their feet wet, starting to present to people across the country, they spoke in a lot more absolutes, and it kind of turned me off. But this year they introduced a lot more nuance that I appreciated. So yeah, I think that's the best way to boil it down. And how I've applied that over time has kind of changed. Like I said before, with the terrestrials, they squat really well, and the aerials are a little more upright. Oh, trap bar deads, unilateral exercises, step ups. Those are some main movements that I use with the aerials that make them still produce a lot of force, but not feel so compressed and not beat up. To maintain those elastic qualities and still giving them the plyometrics and the things that make them elite.
What does that have any effect on programming, whether it's in season or out of season with your athletes? Because obviously in season there's quite a bit more going on, or is it across the board you're kind of similar?
I think it's across the board. Again, if anything, motor preferences is kind of validating some things that I already know.
Yep.
About these individuals. And I think like in season, we only have so much training time anyway. So to be hyper specific is kind of missing the forest for the trees. I'm trying to fill big buckets. I'm not trying to get hyper specific. You try to get hyper specific in season, it's not really going to be conducive to success and maintaining the qualities you want to maintain. We have our big rocks. We have a very finite amount of time to accomplish those things. And if anything, the motor preferences is mostly beneficial for the skill practice, which, I have a little bit of influence on. I try to support the skill in the weight room with medicine ball throws and certain cueing and how we're positioning, our bodies and orienting our center of mass when we're doing certain drills and certain field drills. But I think the sport coaches get a ton more utility out of the motor preferences than just do.
Got you. When you were talking about the force plate test you do twice a week, is that just a counter movement jump, or what are you actually testing with those?
Yeah, it's CMJ. It's okay. CMJ only. Last year, I got very granular with how I used them because the team last year was very experienced. They had a pretty solid training base, and this year we're very young. So last year, I was looking at force time curves. For anyone that's listening to this podcast, I recommend you read Takeoff by Daniel Bove. He goes into force plate diagnostics and how to determine, what your athlete's proficient in and what they might be deficient in. So last year I looked at things like eccentric RFD. Are you able to load fast on the plates? Do you produce a unimodal curve, or do you have a bimodal curve? Like, is there a break in that eccentric loading phase? So last year, given the closer proximity to their genetic potential of that upper class group, I use that stuff a little more. But now with my young team, all of them are pretty much presenting with pretty similar curves. And that's just, I think, due to the inexperience. Yeah. And the lack of strength and the lack of know-how to actually do a jump proficiently. Like, you actually have to teach them, like, hey, it shouldn't be a slow load. We're trying to attack the ground, reverse out of it fast. That in itself is a skill. And a lot of these things like eccentric RFD, like, I'm not even sure if it's a quality that you should be targeting, because it's going to get better if they just learn how to jump.
Yeah.
So is it something you need to, like, target and have a focal point on? Probably not. I think it's just get them strong and expose them to sprinting, like all the general things when they're young, and then get a little more specific down the line with maybe more true plyometrics, or even like accentuated eccentric loading or more reactive methods, things like that. We don't have many athletes doing reactive things right now. I've got one senior, and she doesn't really benefit from that type of stuff anyway. And also, given her position, it's not a huge concern for me to give her those advanced things. So it's also just knowing the athlete and whether the application of those sophisticated methods is going to benefit them in the first place.
And how are you going? Because I've seen kind of your Instagram and stuff that you're doing with your athletes for a little while now. And there's what appears to be, a lot of emphasis on speed, plyometrics, power development, all those sorts of stuff. How do you go about that with a population like softball that you're working with, that, they're not a field or track based sport, so it may come a little bit harder to some of them? Or how does that kind of fit in?
Yeah, I think the way that I approach my own speed training myself, people think that I'm taking those same exact things and doing that with my athletes. Like
Yeah.
I'm not, because a lot of them are not speed trained,
Mhm.
really. Like I said, the early specialization. Some of these club teams are playing like 8 to 12 games a week in the summertime. Like they're getting a lot of running in the sport itself, but from a softball standpoint, it starts with assessing the game. Like, what are they getting a lot of? They're getting a ton of change of direction. They're getting a lot of short first step accelerations. They're getting a lot of first step quickness. Given the confines of the field, they're not hitting max velocity much. So, given that, acceleration is a huge KPI for us. I do a ton of horizontal vector jumps and plyos. We do a lot of chain sprints to reinforce the technique. We do a lot of med ball chest passes. We do a lot of sled and prowler pushes to get on those angles and be strong there.
Mhm.
We do a lot of change direction. I do a lot of 8-vector jumps with them. So it's really refining the acceleration aspect, and the maximal strength is big for females in general. Like females, maximal strength is pretty low on average. So maximal strength is really the thing I'm pursuing 90% of the time with these athletes. And I could pretty much like rinse and repeat that for a pretty long period of time and not need to think about much else, as long as we're sprinting and progressing our jumps. So, when we get to in season, like I said, they're getting a lot of the acceleration on the field. During that period, I moved to much more of a frequency microdose model with the speed development.
Mhm.
And we don't have isolated speed days in our training week. It's more just microdosing before practice, hitting a couple of high speed exposures during our warm up with either like crescendo or build up runs, or just, 2-point starts as fast as you can out to 30, 35 yards. Even 35 yards is pretty long for a softball athlete. We'd probably cap it like 25, 30 yards and then let them go into practice. So trying to kill two birds with one stone with the microdosing, getting them to experience the high speed exposures, and then warming them up for practice. So that's my speed development in season, but most of the year, I'd say 95% of the time, we are focused on first step quickness, early acceleration, late acceleration, and building the qualities that are conducive to those phases of the sprint.
And it's funny you mentioned how for a high percentage of the athletes, even just working on maximal strength development is gonna, be a tide that kind of lifts all boats. And it's the same
Yeah.
thing, especially with my population, like youth athletes, high school athletes. It's funny because you'll get the sport coaches or even parents or something come in and be like, we really want to work on his agility or her speed or her this or her that. And, she's 12, 13, 14. I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, we'll work on that, but maybe not how you
Yeah.
think.
Everybody wants to do the sexy stuff. Seldom is it required or necessary. And I do want to say one thing, like, and this is just a quality of being a human being, is like you want to maximize your knowledge, and everybody wants to apply what we've learned. It's a bias that we all possess as human beings, is like we don't want to waste our time. So like I feel like every time I go to read something new, it's an innovative new thing, but like seldom, like I said, do we need to use these things. So you really have to be self-aware and also aware of like where your athlete's at, and have the criteria to assess where they're at to be able to determine like if those things are necessary. Like I don't think I need to be doing super maximal eccentrics with a freshman group. Like maybe one day, I don't have weight releasers, but
Yeah.
like, I'm just using it as an example. Maybe one day I would use it for a couple athletes that I can just think of off the top of my head right now. Like, yeah, she might be able to do something like that and get good benefit one day. But 95% of the team is not going to need that. And the other reason I say that is because softball is it's an we're in season all the time. The only time we're not in season is 4 weeks in August going into September, and then we have a couple weeks off that we just came off of, but it's an academic period. So like they're not even mandated to come into the weight room.
Mhm.
It's voluntary, and they're studying like crazy. So the amount of specificity and intensity that I can deliver during that time period is pretty minimal to begin with. So if you're in season all year long, your adaptive reserve, your neurological currency, your ability to continue adapting at a rate that would make those sophisticated things required to be implemented, very hard to get to that point if you're competing all year long. So I think coaches need to look at their schedule and how demanding the sport actually is before they actually think about implementing all these new things.
Yeah, I constantly kind of find myself having an inner battle because there's so much information out there, and I'm sure just like you, like I like to learn as much as possible, but I then kind of reel myself back in. I'm like, well, one, let's look at my population or the majority of it, and what do they actually need? And I'm like, man, some simple things are going to go really far for these guys.
Yeah, and we always want to give our athletes their our best,
Yeah,
which is great, but you should never be, like I said before. I think I just summed up exactly what I wanted to say there, but
yeah,
we got to be very self-aware is really all I'm trying to say.
yeah. And it's funny. I also have you mentioned the weight releasers, and earlier this week an athlete came up to me and like had a his Instagram photo, was like, oh, what are these look cool, and I was like, yeah, those are cool.
Yeah,
One day maybe.
yeah.
But to go now to, I've heard, I don't know, I've heard a lot of different takes on rotational power, even to the point of like, does it exist, does it not exist, what are the vectors, what are the forces, all these sorts of things. What's your kind of like, how do you treat working with rotational athletes and developing power within them?
Okay, so I'm going to start with this. Let's say you have an athlete who, let's say they're jumping 65 centimeters on Hawken on the force
Hmm.
plates or Vault, whatever you use. Let's say you use Hawken or Vault, and this athlete's popping 65. Say an athlete's pretty powerful, right? Let's say that athlete has never done a hidden bound or a lateral bound before in their life, and then they go do it for the first time. I would predict they do pretty well. Like they can jump pretty far because power and strength and all these biomotor qualities are, I don't think that they're plane specific. I think they're skill sets more so than they're like direction specific. So I think rotational power is a product of many different things. I think it's ground reaction force. I think it's timing. I think it's comfort and strength in the end ranges of motion. And I think it's more so a skill. I don't think that it's direction specific. Like a lot of our powerful athletes, they do very well jumping laterally. I think like the general broad category of power is going to trickle into the different planes of movement, but at that point it becomes a skill. Like if you never practice lateral bounds or if you never practice swinging a bat, like you're not going to be proficient in those things. But like we look at blast motion. Blast motion is it's like the accelerometer that goes on the knob of your bat. Like
Hmm.
we see, we do see progress in bat speed and bat acceleration. So there's something there, but is it its own biomotor quality? I don't think it is. I think it's just skill. I think it's practicing your swing, practicing your throwing, understanding how to throw, understanding how the different joint segments move and work together to create the most efficient throw or swing path. And that's the byproduct of it. Like I don't think that it's direction specific. I think a powerful athlete is going to be able to, like, let's say you took a power lifter. Like I bet they can swing a bat like pretty hard,
Yeah.
like pretty damn hard, but I don't think that it's because that they've worked on that. Like it's just it's a result. It's a indirect result of what they've done to lift up all the other things that they've been focusing on maybe. Yeah, I don't think that it's direction specific. I don't think that it's its own quality. Like I see some sports using like Kaiser rotations and they have like the watts
Yeah.
on the Kaiser screen. Like that's cool, but I don't think that you're like isolating just rotation. You're practicing harnessing ground reaction forces and you're practicing on the sequencing. And maybe it's good for movement variability, like you're just doing it in a different way in a non-sport specific context. So I don't think that things like Kaiser rotations and max effort med ball throws are a waste of time. I think they're good for learning the sequencing, learning how to use the ground, use your legs, and transmit that force up into the joint segments that are going to be responsible for delivering the final whip or the final blow into the ball. So I really don't know if I have much else to add. I think there's a lot of semantics going on with that debate, and
Yeah.
I need to think a little bit more about it to actually give a more clear answer. I hope I was clear,
No,
but
yeah.
that's kind of where I stand with it.
So would your advice to a semi novice athlete wanting to quote unquote increase their rotational power essentially be to have a good training program kind of all around?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dumb it down. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want to be
Simplify it.
oversimplify it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'll give you a good example of how we might like improve rotational power or swing speed. Like, if there's a specific move that I know an athlete needs, and we've had conversations as a skill staff about like what the athlete needs to be practicing, then I'm going to try to cue things like med ball throws the same way that they're going to cue the swing. And that's just, now we're just boiling it down to mixed practice of motor development and skill development. Like, that's just what mixed practice is. You're delivering similar cueing in different contexts. You're recalling information. You're recalling different cueing. And we hope, in theory, that that's going to help embed the skill a little better. So that's how I'm approaching it. Yeah, I'm never in the cages helping them with skill practice. Like, that's not where I come in. But that's how I try to serve that area of their development.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like you said, it does come down to also whatever your sport is, whether it's softball or baseball, obviously swinging a bat, there's a huge skill component to that anyway. So while a weightlifter or a powerlifter might be strong enough to do something, they may not necessarily have the skill component to swing a bat hard or whatever it may be.
Right.
But yeah, it's something that's been floated around recently, and I just like to hear people's opinions on it, because I think it does come down to semantics more than anything. Like, we're just
Yeah, I mean, with the semantics too, like, whether or not you call it rotational power or not, or we agree, like, oh, is it a quality, is it not? Like, let's be honest, everyone's still going to try to develop the same thing the same way. Like,
yeah,
you're still gonna train similarly. So, like, what's the point of, like, yeah, I understand the point of the debate. Like, we have to get our terminology right as a field and like
yep.
speak the same language and understand. We have to have a common like dictionary vocabulary for these things and understanding, but the methods are still going to be the same.
Yeah, definitely. Are you doing anything for quote unquote shoulder health in your training sessions, like any prehab or any specific exercises, rotator cuff, this, that, the other?
Yeah, I did a post the other day on the importance of traction. I'm not sure if you saw it, but
I, I
I
did
think
actually, yeah.
I think a lot of, and this is a good thing to focus on. A lot of coaches are focused on range of motion at the scapula, protraction, retraction, upward rotation, activation and strength of the lower trap, trying to deactivate the upper trap to avoid impingement symptoms and things like that, which is very well intentioned. I think something that we miss out on with the rotator cuff is actually challenging its stability aspects too. I think we isolate rotation a lot, but we don't target the traction aspect and the stability aspect and challenge the rotator cuff to keep the humeral head in the shoulder socket, in the glenoid fossa enough. So I do a lot of things like dead hangs. I do a lot of things like with dumbbell rows, like people like to rush out of the bottom of a row. Like, I like my athletes to embrace the bottom of a row. Like, almost relax your shoulder and let the dumbbell just pull your humeral head out of its socket. Not out of its socket, but like
Yeah.
trying to pull it out and then pull back. Like, challenge that aspect of your shoulder integrity a little more. Like, I think I've said this to a lot of coaches before. I've never seen a team execute Jaeger bands like with perfect execution. Like, before practice, they do their band routines like Y, T, W, field goals. Like, it's always rushed. It's never done with the proper tempo, with the right intent. It like that can't be where our shoulder care ends. And you said it before, like, does it just come down to a well designed program? Like, I'm gonna say yeah in a sense, but again, not trying to make it like overly simple. I do a lot of crawling, a ton of crawling. I do a ton of heavy overhead pressing, a lot of heavy horizontal pressing. I really like plyometric push-ups. I like deep range of motion, like as far as you can get down, trying to pull yourself into a relaxed deep push-up. And again, with the rotational powers, like, you'll appear more powerful rotationally throwing wise if you have strength and motor control and neurological control over that end range of your pec, because the pec is going to play a major role in delivering the ball at separation. So that's where my arm care kind of boils down to. Comfort in end ranges and really challenging the strength there. Also, a lot of direct bicep and tricep work, I think, goes a very long way. Sometimes in our upper body sessions, we'll do some prep work with just banded bicep curls and extensions overhead extensions, a lot of different ranges of motion and different directions with the arm care, with the direct bicep and tricep stuff. People forget that the bicep and tricep, they're both medial elbow stabilizers. So the bicep and tricep will come in when handling pronation and supination, and also valgus and varus stresses, mainly valgus stress in a throw. So I've seen a lot of value in doing that as either a finisher or some prep work.
Have you
So
done any grip stuff?
Yeah, we measure grip on the VALD, the hand dynamometer.
Yep.
And I've also incorporated the ASH test this year on the force plates. And with the position players, we'll get them into their throwing position, like into their arm slot. And then pitchers, I've actually done both overhead and underhand. So like where they, softball pitchers, they release at their hips. So like we've looked at both. And it's what you would expect. Like the pitchers are much stronger in that A position than the Y positions. The whole point of the ASH testing, I'm not trying to pursue a certain metric. I'm trying to look at player norms so that when we get to season and their workloads are really high and we're tracking those, it's just like we're looking at things like time to take off an RSI. Like, are we looking at arm fatigue right now? Like, what are the risk factors of this athlete continuing to pitch this week? Like, do they need a little bit less workload going into this weekend, given the ASH test? Like, things like that, plus the grip strength testing, are all things that we're going to kind of consider this year as a medical staff or performance staff.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm glad you brought up the ASH test because it's something that I don't personally have a ton of experience with other than just reading about it. But I train quite a big swim population, and there's somebody on island that has gotten force plates and has been doing the ASH test. So do you use it more as, you did say about monitoring injury risk and things like that, but also for an athlete that maybe is coming back from an injury, or like how are you best using the ASH test and what is it showing you?
Well, what I look at is peak force. That's really
Okay.
the only metric that I'm looking at. I'm not looking at things like RFD to peak force or RFD at peak force at 50 milliseconds, like you would on a isometric mid thigh pull, for example. Like, I do want to see the numbers increase, but in the fall, it was just about gathering baseline and gathering like player norms and averages. So I haven't had any athletes that have been like apprehensive about doing the test, and we haven't really had any serious shoulder problems to where I could give you an answer on that. Again, this is my first fall using it, but I mean, I would expect like some inhibition and like lower numbers with the shoulder testing, but just with a lower like a leg injury, you're going to see some metrics kind of plummet on the force plates. So if you see some longitudinal increases in those numbers, sharing those with the athletes is really good for their confidence. I mean,
Yeah.
When I was doing hamstring return to plays with Kansas City, we used the Nordboard test all the time to give athletes a better sense of objectives and objective measures to get them confident. And like one of the final stages of our hamstring return to play protocol was, do you feel 110% ready to return?
Yeah.
And like, how do you cultivate that confidence? I think a lot of it is just closure with the information that you're acquiring.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. To switch gears slightly, obviously you train with, quite a big team of athletes. How many are on the softball team?
21.
Okay.
Yeah,
I thought it was bigger, actually.
it's really not bad. It's pretty
Okay.
manageable. It's manageable.
I swear back in college, our softball team had like 30 plus
Yeah,
players on it.
some teams are pretty big. I think we're one of the smallest, to be honest. I don't know for sure.
Fair enough. But so are there any misconceptions that you'd like to let maybe some younger athletes know about, or, kind of debunk a little bit about the weight room and its effects, or the effects that it might not have?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that strength and conditioning is going to make me better at my sport. Like, I think our transfer is not as significant as we might like it to be as strength coaches, especially at the level that I'm at. I don't always have to be so worried about like making them better at their sport all the time, because it's such a high level of softball that most of the time it's just, look, you are lacking in the physical development department. We need to get you more prepared for the demands at this level, because you're not used to the game at this level, the speeds at this level, the frequency of play. That's what's more important for me. Not to say that the skill side's unimportant, but I think I think people are attributing way too much value to the transfer of the training to the
Yep.
game. Um, like I heard Daniel Bach say this. He runs Jump Science. Daniel
Mhm.
Bach said general strength transfers a lot better when you have the skill base, but if you don't have the skill base, general strength is going to transfer a lot less. So, athletes that have a background of jumping, sprinting, if you get them a little stronger, you're going to see an easier transfer. It's going to be a lot more of a seamless transition. But if they don't have the skill aspect to it, I don't care how much stronger your squat gets or your lunge gets or all these other things. If you're not understanding how your body moves and you're not breaking yourself down in your mechanics and how your technical and tactical responses to the game, nothing's going to change. So I think that's a big thing, at least that I've heard of a lot. I think strength and conditioning coaches have created that. Like, I think we try to validate our role by talking about like how much transfer we're going to provide all the time. And like, that's not always what it's about. Like, we are, at the end of the day, strength and conditioning coaches. We are trying to condition and raise their physical qualities as much as we can. If we've done that, like, we've done pretty good. And this reminds me of a sentiment that I think about all the time, and or an adage. It's like, the team might be very successful, but they might be successful in spite of your programming. Like,
Yep.
elite athletes can still perform at an extremely high level, even if your program sucks. And like, even if the team is elite, like, that doesn't mean that you're responsible for it. And if the team is really bad also on the field, that also doesn't mean that you're responsible for that either. You could be a really good strength coach, but the team is they're just not performing. But like, what is it? Like, we think about that 4 coactive model, right? Psychological, technical, tactical, physical. Like, which one of those things is it? And it's really hard to assess that. But those are my thoughts with that.
Yeah, it is tough, especially as a coach. You obviously want what's best for the team or individual players or athletes, but you don't want to get tied up too much in the positives and definitely not in the negatives either.
Yeah, I think we give ourselves way too much credit, but we also kick ourselves way too much than we need to.
Yeah.
Like, way too much. I think for me, like, the indicator for me is as to whether I'm doing a good job is like, are they more physical? Are they getting faster? And are they healthy? Like, health is the first most important thing. Like, are they fit for the demands of the schedule and the game? And if I've met those demands, I'm pretty happy. Now, like, I'm not saying that I'll be happy still if we're a losing team. Like, I think I'm a part of that process, and the psychology behind it, and the athlete's mentality, and their buy-in, and their focus, and their effort. Like, I do think that we have an impact on that, especially in the college setting, which is so team oriented. Like, we do have an influence of that. But yeah, I think coaches can really save themselves a lot of stress and not be so miserable if they didn't blame themselves for everything. Because I think a lot of coaches are doing that. They're just knocking themselves down 24/7 because they feel responsible that the team is like 9-30. Like, it's not your fault.
There's more that goes into it. I want to be cautious of your time. So one final question. And it's just, is there any piece of advice that you'd give to whether it be a younger you or just a younger athlete in general who's maybe wanting to, take sports as far as they can go, hopefully play in college and see what happens?
Yes, you need to be experimenting on yourself. You have got to be your own guinea pig. Your biggest lab rat needs to be yourself. I cannot tell you like how much I've put myself through the ringer, just trying different things and pushing the envelope to the absolute brink to learn like what's effective. How am I going to use this in a practical sense? I don't care how much you read about something or how confident you are in putting it into practice. Until you put it into practice on yourself in a controlled environment where the risk is no further than like maybe you become a little overtrained and you don't hurt someone that you're responsible for. Like, you need to be putting yourself in that situation every time you come across something new that you want to implement. I can't stress that enough. Like, my interns, I run our internship program here at Oklahoma, and I'm constantly encouraging them to train. And if they're not, first of all, a red flag. You need to be love training, and number two, like, how are you going to know what's enough for your athletes and also what's too little? If I can't handle the training, they certainly can't handle it. So just things like that. And working through scheduling, and even something as simple as like, how do I feel going into a lift if this is my speed work volume? Like, can I go into a lift and produce a good effort right after this if I sprint X amount? Or, monitoring force plate stuff. Like, before you decide to use force plate information to dictate the direction you go with a team, or like how much stimulus might be too much, or if you're under training them, like, have you looked at your own trends? Like, have you experimented with yourself? It just comes down to experimentation and just practice the information. You really need to be experimenting. And part of that is having conversations with people who are doing this every single day. I get questions all the time from people on Instagram, and, kudos to those guys because they're talking to someone who's living this stuff every single day. I'm not saying that the old information is not useful. Like, you should know it and you should be interested in that stuff. But how, in a practical sense, is it being applied? That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that because literally listening to your last podcast and hearing you say, if coaches ever want to reach out or anything like that, that's part of the reason that I even thought about reaching out to you. Because like, this guy seems pretty open. I'm sure he'd be open to have a chat, talk about things, and obviously it'd be great to learn from him.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't big league anybody. If you send me a question, I'm answering it. I know I might take a week or two to answer, but I because I was that person,
Yeah.
and some people are hesitant to bother someone to, pick their brain or, ask a question. And it's like, no, it's quite the opposite. We want to give back. I think if you're a well-intentioned professional in this field, like, you want to give back. And if you're not doing that, I find that strange. Like, we were all that one person one day that was just clueless.
Yep.
So
Where
we got to
can where
help each.
can where can people find you?
People can find me on Instagram, Pedulla Performance. That's Pedulla Performance. And you can email me, joe.pedulla@pedullaperformance.com. So I would love to get on the horn with some of those people. If you want to reach out, I'll be happy to talk to y'all.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Liam. Thank you so much.